The kitchen of the Tremblay mansion was a world of fire and iron. Smoke clung to the rafters, and the hiss of fat hitting flame filled the air like a song no one dared to stop listening to. Violet stood at the center of it, her hands moving quick and silent, chopping, stirring, tasting, adjusting, never once slowing. Her eyes, though, told a different story. They burned not with the heat of the fire, but with something colder, something that had been building for years. At 17, she had learned to make a roux so perfect the master's guests praised the cook for days after. At 19, she could roast duck so tender, the meat slid from the bone with nothing but a whisper of a knife. At 24, her hands were calloused, her arms strong, her back scarred, her voice quiet. She was a kitchen slave, one of many in the Tremblay house. But unlike the rest, she carried an invisible weight that pressed against her ribs every night. Rage, every order barked at her, every insult muttered in French or English, every time the mistress of the house complained about her slow hands while sitting in a parlor with lace gloves. Violet remembered. She remembered the sting of a slap when the soup was too hot. She remembered the crack of a whip against her cousin Isaiah's back for stealing bread. She remembered the night her mother, bent from years of labor, was sold down river without warning. She remembered everything. The kitchen was her prison, but also her battlefield. The masters never understood that a woman who handled their food 3 times a day held a power greater than their whips or chains. They thought her invisible, like the smoke in the rafters. They thought her obedient, like the iron pots on the hooks. They thought wrong. Violet moved between the tables, dropping handfuls of chopped herbs into a pot. The scent of thyme, bay leaf, and garlic filled the air, masking the sour odor of sweat and smoke. Around her, other enslaved workers moved cautiously, glancing at her every now and then. They knew she was different. She carried herself with a sharpness that cut through the dull haze of servitude. She didn't talk much, but when she did, her words carried weight. "Salt," she whispered, not looking up. Young Elsie, barely 12, hurried forward with a bowl of coarse salt. Violet sprinkled it into the stew and stirred slowly, her spoon cutting lazy circles. She thought of the master's face when he would taste it later, how he would close his eyes and sigh like a king feasting, how he would never imagine that the same woman who cooked his meals dreamed of seeing him choke. Outside, the city of New Orleans buzzed with life. The streets were alive with the shuffle of horses, the cries of vendors, the thick accents of French, Spanish, English, and Creole mixing in the humid air. Ships docked at the river, unloading sugar, cotton, and human lives. The Tremblay family's wealth came from that trade. Every elegant plate of food that Violet set before them was seasoned with blood, her people's blood. She learned to hide her thoughts well. When the mistress demanded a cake at midnight, Violet baked it with a smile. When the master sent her to fetch wine, she curtsied as if she cared. When the guests praised her skill, she bowed her head like she had no pride of her own. But in the silence of the kitchen, when the last candle was out and only the coals glowed red, Violet allowed herself to imagine. She imagined a table set as usual, the Tremblays laughing, drinking, their mouths greedy with gumbo cornbread and roast pig. She imagined their voices turning to coughs, their coughs turning to screams, their hands clawing at their throats. She imagined the silence after, broken only by the crackle of the fire, and she imagined herself standing there spoon in hand, finally free. It started as a dream, a cruel fantasy to keep her sane, but the more she thought about it, the more real it became. She knew herbs better than anyone in the house. She knew which roots could soothe fever and which could stop a heart. She had seen old women in the quarters whisper about powders and teas that killed quietly. She had watched children die after chewing the wrong leaf by the riverbank. Knowledge lived in her hands, passed down in fragments, hidden in plain sight. The masters thought food was their luxury. For Violet, it was a weapon. That night, as she scrubbed the last of the pots clean, she stared into the dark water in the basin. Her reflection wavered, broken by ripples. She barely recognized herself anymore. The young girl who once sang while grinding spices was gone. In her place stood a woman hollowed out by loss, sharpened by rage, and made dangerous by patience. When the others shuffled off to the quarters, Violet lingered. She placed her hand on the wooden shelf where dried herbs hung in bunches, their earthy smell filling the air. Her fingers brushed over sage, rosemary, and something else. A small pouch tucked behind the jars, filled with a dark powder she had collected over weeks. It was bitter, deadly, and waiting. She closed her eyes and pictured the Tremblays again. Their laughter, their cruelty, their ignorance. And for the first time she didn't just imagine their end, she planned it. The kitchen fire had burned low, but her own fire burned higher than ever. Violet was no longer just a cook, she was something far more dangerous. Violet had not been born into the Tremblay mansion. She had been carried into it, her wrists bound, her future stolen before she had the chance to dream of one. She was 12 the day she was sold. The memory was carved into her bones like a scar she could never wash away. The market was loud that morning, a place where human beings were stacked and traded like sacks of grain. Men with heavy purses poked at teeth, pulled at arms, inspected muscles. Mothers clutched their children, only to be pulled apart by hands that saw no family, only price. Violet remembered her mother's grip on her shoulder, trembling, desperate. Then the sound of numbers called out, the cry of a man sealing a deal, and her mother's hand was gone, just gone. The Tremblays bought her for the kitchen, a girl small enough to move quickly, sharp enough to follow orders, strong enough to endure heat and hunger. They didn't look at her face when they paid. She was an object, a pair of hands, nothing more. For years, Violet worked like a shadow. She learned to grind spices until the smell clung to her skin. She learned to gut fish by the river, the blood seeping into the mud. She learned to knead dough until her arms ached, and every night, she crawled into a corner of the quarters, listening to the sound of muffled sobs, the crack of the whip outside, the low groans of the broken. But even in her silence, Violet saw everything. She saw the way the master's eyes lingered on the housemaid, how he would disappear into the parlor with her, and how she would come out with bruises hidden under her dress. She saw the mistress of the house, her face painted with rouge, smiling at guests while striking the servants for the smallest mistake. She saw her cousin Isaiah, whipped until his back opened like torn cloth because he dared to eat from a plate before it was carried to the table. She saw children beaten for spilling water, men chained for running, women sold without goodbye. The mansion was dressed in gold and silver, but Violet knew it was built on bones. It was Isaiah's punishment that changed her. She was 16 when it happened. He was older, 20 maybe, strong, rebellious. He whispered at night about freedom, about the upriver plantations where some had risen against their masters, about men who escaped into the swamps and never returned. His voice lit fires in the hearts of the younger ones. Violet used to listen in silence, hope and fear twisting in her chest. One night, Isaiah slipped into the kitchen and stole bread, just bread. He shared it with 2 children, who hadn't eaten all day. By morning, he was caught. They tied him to a post in the yard. Every slave in the household was forced to watch. The whip came down again and again, the sound slicing the air. His back split open, blood running down his skin, but he did not scream. Violet stood in the crowd, her nails digging into her palms until they bled. She wanted to look away. She forced herself not to. When it was done, Isaiah could barely stand. The master turned to the others and said, "This is what happens when you forget your place." That night, Violet wept into her hands, but when the tears dried, something colder settled inside her. She realized that day that pain was endless, unless someone ended it. Not long after, she noticed the whispers of older women in the quarters. They spoke of roots and herbs, of teas that healed and teas that killed. They spoke of the green blessing and the black curse. Some called it hoodoo, some called it medicine, some called it survival. Violet listened with ears sharp as knives. She learned slowly. which leaves could calm a fever, which berries burned the throat, which powders, if slipped into wine, could end a man's breath by dawn. She never asked directly. Questions drew suspicion, but she watched, she listened, she remembered. Her chance came one humid afternoon when she was sent to the market with Elsie. The stalls overflowed with spices, dried fish, herbs hung in bundles. Amid the chatter of Creole vendors, Violet spotted a small stand run by an old woman with a face carved deep by time. On her table lay jars of powders, pouches of roots, bottles of liquids darker than molasses. Violet lingered, pretending to examine peppers. The woman looked at her once, eyes sharp as a blade. No words were exchanged, just a look that said she knew. That night, Violet found in her apron pocket a small pouch, wrapped tight, filled with something bitter and strange. She said nothing. She hid it. She waited. From that day forward, the thought of vengeance never left her. While she chopped onions, she thought of the pouch. While she stirred stew, she thought of the pouch. While she lay on the dirt floor at night, listening to the rats scratch in the dark, she thought of the pouch. But the dream was dangerous. Slaves caught with poison were tortured, burned, made examples of. Rumors ran through New Orleans of entire kitchens hanged after a single master fell ill. Fear kept her still, yet rage kept her restless. Her hands became steady, her smile convincing. To the Tremblays, she was nothing but a servant, skilled but silent. To herself, she was something else, a woman who carried fire under her tongue and death in her apron. She knew she could not act in haste. One wrong step, one careless mistake, and she would be dragged through the streets, body broken before the city's eyes. So she waited. She studied her master's habits. She learned which foods they loved most, when they ate, what they drank, how they praised her cooking. She memorized their laughter, their cruelty, their faces flushed with wine. The pouch stayed hidden in the kitchen shelf, tucked behind dried rosemary. Every day she checked it, touched it, reminded herself it was real. Her rage had become a plan that one day would turn the Tremblay's table from a place of pleasure into a place of death. The plan did not come all at once. It unfolded slowly, like smoke curling through rafters, twisting, spreading, filling every corner before anyone noticed. Violet had patience. She had learned long ago that survival itself was an act of waiting, waiting for punishment to end, waiting for hunger to fade, waiting for morning after nights filled with screams. Now she turned that patience into her sharpest weapon. She began with knowledge. Every trip to the market was no longer just an errand. It was reconnaissance. She memorized which stalls sold dried herbs that could kill in small doses. She learned which roots resembled harmless seasoning when ground fine. She noticed which powders were bitter, which were sweet, which could dissolve easily in broth. She never bought directly, too risky, but she asked questions that seemed innocent. What makes this root so strong in flavor? How much of this pepper would sicken a man if he ate too much? Vendors answered carelessly, laughing, not realizing the depth behind her eyes. At night, she experimented, not recklessly, never with the pouch itself. She started with harmless herbs, testing doses in small bowls of stew, watching the bitterness rise, tasting carefully to see how much could be hidden by salt or wine. She learned how to mask strong flavors with sugar. She learned how garlic could bury bitterness under its sharp sting. The kitchen itself became her laboratory, though no one but she knew it. She tested on pests when she could. A rat that crept into the pantry one night was caught and given a crumb dipped in her mixture. By dawn, it lay stiff in the corner. Violet buried it quietly, her heart pounding. It worked. The knowledge gave her courage, but courage was not enough. She needed timing. The Tremblays hosted guests often, business partners, wealthy planters, men who spoke of trade and politics, while drinking wine until their voices slurred. Violet listened to them boast about their wealth, their land, their human property. Sometimes she had to bite her tongue until it bled, to keep from screaming. Those nights, she imagined slipping the pouch into the pot, letting poison spread through every mouth at the table, but she held back. Too many eyes, too much suspicion. She needed the perfect moment,
The house itself offered rhythms. The master drank more heavily when business went poorly. The mistress demanded sweets when she was restless. The children, spoiled and cruel, played games in the yard, their laughter cutting through the slave's misery like a whip. Violet knew them all. She knew when the family was loud and when they were vulnerable. She knew which meals mattered most. Every day she moved with perfect obedience. Her silence was her mask. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. A bow, a nod, a curtsy. She stirred their soups, roasted their meats, served their wine with steady hands. They never saw the storm behind her eyes. Among the quarters whispers spread. Some of the older slaves sensed something in her. They watched her more closely, perhaps recognizing the glint in her gaze. Once, an older woman, Aunt Thelma, pulled her aside. "Child," she said, her voice low, rough as gravel, "I see the fire in you. Don't let it burn you up." Violet said nothing. She could not. Even words could betray her. But at night, she thought of Thelma's warning. She knew the risk. She knew what happened to those caught with poison. They were dragged into the square, stripped, broken. She had seen it once, years ago, when a young man from another household was accused of poisoning his master's drink. His body had been left hanging as a warning. And yet, the image did not scare her away. If anything, it pressed her forward. Better to die fighting, she thought, than to live on her knees forever. One humid evening, while the cicadas screamed outside, and the air clung heavy with heat, Violet found herself alone in the kitchen. The others had gone to sleep. She stood before the shelf where the pouch was hidden, her hand hovering over it. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of wood, and the distant sound of laughter from the master's quarters. Her fingers trembled as they touched the pouch. She unwrapped it, just slightly, revealing the dark powder inside. It looked harmless, like ground bark, but she knew better. She thought of her mother's face, the last time she saw it at the auction. She thought of Isaiah's back, torn to ribbons. She thought of Elsie, too young to know anything but servitude, carrying heavy trays with her small arms. She thought of her own life, wasted in smoke and heat, her body bent in service to people who would never see her as human. Her jaw tightened. She closed the pouch, wrapped it again, and returned it to its hiding place. Not yet, but soon. The days that followed built tension inside her like a tightening rope. She began to plan with precision. Which meal, which dish, which guest list. The Tremblays loved her gumbo most. They praised it to every visitor, calling it the pride of the house. Gumbo was perfect. It was dark, thick, complex. Bitterness could hide in it easily, and the family always ate it together. Still, she waited. Patience, timing. The rope was taut, but not ready to snap. Then came the night that shifted everything. A guest arrived from Baton Rouge, a planter who bragged loudly of buying new slaves fresh off the ship. At dinner he spoke of their strong backs and fine teeth, while the Tremblays laughed and nodded. Violet stood at the edge of the room, tray in hand, her face a mask. Inside, her stomach churned with fury. When the man called her over, grabbing her wrist to make her refill his glass, she froze. His grip was hard, his smile leering. "Fine cook, this one," he said to the table. "Keep her close, or she'll be stolen." Laughter erupted. Violet's jaw clenched. She pulled her wrist free, bowed her head and walked away. That night, she could not sleep. She lay awake on the dirt floor, staring at the ceiling, every muscle in her body tight. Something had broken. Waiting was no longer survival. It was torture. She knew then that her moment had come. The gumbo, the pouch, the table, the fire inside her was no longer patient. It was hungry. The day broke heavy and wet, air like a damp cloth. By noon the mistress announced a small supper for favored guests. Not a ball, not a feast. Intimate, perfect. Violet nodded without blinking. "Gumbo," the mistress said, lazy and proud. "Your best." Violet answered yes, and walked to the kitchen with steady feet and shaking hands. She began before dusk. Flour in the iron pot, oil, a wooden spoon cutting slow circles. She stirred until the roux turned the color of dark earth. Too light, and they'd taste it. Too dark, and it would burn. She knew the line and held it. The smell rose up, deep, nutty, thick. Elsie stood by with onions and celery and bell peppers. Violet dropped them in. Steam leapt. The sizzle hid her breath. She boiled stock in a second pot. She cleaned shrimp and crab and sausage. She kept her motion simple. She didn't break rhythm, not once. Around her the kitchen moved like a small city. Boots on the back steps, a door closing somewhere, a laugh above the floorboards. She kept tally in her head. Master, mistress, 2 neighbors, the Baton Rouge planter, maybe the lawyer from Chartres Street. 6 plates, 6 bowls, 6 chances. She made 2 gumbos, always had. 1 for the dining room, 1 for the quarters. That choice had been made days ago. She had gathered extra bones for the safe pot, made it rich, so no one in the quarters would be tempted by the dining room leftovers. She pointed Elsie to the safe pot. For us, she said. Don't touch the other. Elsie nodded fast. Her eyes asked a question. Violet didn't answer. The pouch waited where it always waited, behind dried rosemary, tucked quiet. Violet wiped her hands and reached for it without looking. The weight in her palm felt smaller than it should have. She didn't open it yet. She set it near the stove, away from any curious eyes. She called for bread. She told the boy to fetch more wood. She sent everyone on small errands that moved them away from the stove and the shelf and her hands. She tasted the dining room pot. Salt, pepper, a little heat from cayenne, not too much. She added gumbo filet, a slow sprinkle. The broth went silk thick. She let it simmer, low and patient. The clock in her chest ticked louder than the one on the mantel upstairs. The guests arrived as the sky bruised purple. The hallway filled with greetings and cigar smoke. Violet heard the planter's voice first, oiled and loud. The master's laughter followed, tight with pride. The mistress asked for sherry. The house swelled with their comfort. It made her jaw hurt. Violet planned a taster trick days ago. She ladled a small bowl from the safe pot. Identical dish, same garnish. She set it near the service door where the master liked to watch her taste for poison. It was one of his games. He thought it clever. He thought everything he did was clever. She placed a spoon beside the safe bowl and covered it with a folded cloth. No one noticed. She sent the safe gumbo to the quarters with Aunt Thelma, who looked at Violet a long beat. The look said she understood and would keep the children close. Violet's throat tightened but her face stayed flat. Now, she opened the pouch. A dry, bitter smell rose, faint under the pepper and smoke. She held it low and shielded. She tapped a measured amount into her palm. Not enough to turn the flavor. Enough to weigh the blood down, slow the breath, squeeze the heart. She had tested the masking a dozen times. Garlic, wine and heat would bury it. She scraped the powder into the pot and stirred, slow circles cutting the liquid with the back of the spoon to break clumps. She folded in sausage and crab. She watched for any strange shine on the surface. Nothing, just her gumbo dark and glossy, the pride of the house. Elsie reappeared at her elbow. Do you need me to? Bread to the table, then back to the quarters. Violet didn't raise her voice. Elsie left with quick feet. The footman came for the first course. Oysters dressed with lemon safe. A bridge to the main event. Violet plated them with steady hands. When the platters left, she leaned against the cool of the stone wall and let herself breathe. She pictured their faces. She pictured her mother's. The master stepped into the kitchen. He liked this part. He liked the heat he never had to endure. He walked to the pot and inhaled like he owned air itself. My Violet, he said, always perfect. He lifted the cloth from the small bowl at the door. Taste, he said, almost kind. She lifted the spoon, dipped it in the safe bowl and swallowed. She made a show of nodding. Needs a pinch of salt, she said. He chuckled like they shared a joke. He walked out, happy with his control. Her palms were dry. Her heartbeat had slowed. She was past fear now. The machine in her had taken over. She ladled the gumbo into 6 bowls. She wiped the rims clean with the edge of a folded towel. She placed a sprig of parsley on each for the mistress's vanity. The footman returned. He lifted 2, and another boy lifted 2 more. Violet carried the last 2 herself. She liked the weight. The dining room glowed with candles. Silver shone. The guests' faces were warm with wine. The planter winked at her like she should be grateful. She set a bowl before him and stepped back. She served the master last. She looked at his mouth. She didn't look away. They talked while it cooled. They liked to talk. Cotton yields. shipping delays, a jail beating that they called discipline. Violet stood by the sideboard, hands folded, eyes lowered. She could see the entire table from that angle. She could see every spoon. The mistress tasted first. She always did. A small sip, a nod. Perfect, she said. The others followed. Spoons lifted, spoons dipped, spoons vanished into mouths. Violet felt something inside her unclench. She did not smile. She did not move. Minutes passed. Talk filled the gaps. The planter took a second spoonful, then a third. He smacked his lips. The master praised the heat. The lawyer asked about the spice. Violet murmured filet and kept her gaze on their throats. Their throats worked and worked. The clock slid forward. A cough. Small. A cough. Small. The mistress dabbed her mouth with a napkin. Too much pepper, she said, half laughing. Violet tilted her head. I can bring bread, she said. No one answered. Another cough. This time from the neighbor with the slick hair. He took water, swallowed, frowned. The planter leaned back in his chair. He placed his hand on his chest as if testing something. Hot, he said. The word came out thin. He laughed and then stopped. The master's spoon slowed. His eyes went glassy around the edges, then sharp. He looked at Violet, then at the bowl, then at his wife. Wine, he barked. The word scraped. Violet poured. Her fingers didn't shake. The wine went red in their glasses. The planter lifted his and missed his mouth. The neighbor tried to stand and sat back down harder than he meant to. The mistress put her napkin on the table and pressed 2 fingers to her temple like a headache had walked in without knocking. A silence opened under the chatter like a trapdoor. The men tried to keep talking, but their voices thinned. The room filled with small sounds, the scrape of a chair, a breath taken wrong, the rattle of a spoon against china. The master said her name, not loud, not soft, just her name. Violet looked up. Their eyes met like 2 knives touching. He knew something. He didn't know what. The planter pushed his bowl away and reached for the table edge with both hands. His breath went shallow. The lawyer's lips had turned the color of old ash. The mistress closed her eyes and opened them with effort. The neighbor stared at his hands as if they had betrayed him. Violet stepped forward with the bread basket, a perfect servant moving in the right direction. She set it down. No one reached for it. She stood still long enough to see the first real fear enter the room, subtle as a shadow moving over a face. She knew fear. She had carried it like a bucket for years. Now she watched it pour over them. Call the doctor, the master said, voice tight. The footman ran. The hallway swallowed his footsteps. The planter tried to speak and made no sound. A thin line of sweat ran along his temple. He gripped the tablecloth. The mistress touched her own throat and made a small surprised sound, as if she'd found a bruise she didn't know about. The lawyer's chair tipped and corked, scraping the floor with a raw note. Violet's mind moved quickly. Too soon to leave the room. Too slow, and she'd be asked questions before the effects peaked. She lifted a water jug and moved clockwise, pouring, letting them watch her do something useful. She placed a hand on the mistress's glass to steady it. The mistress's ring cut a bright line in the candlelight. Violet remembered that ring on the day of the auction. She had been 12. Her hand didn't shake. The master tried to stand. His legs argued with him and lost. He sat down hard. He looked at his bowl like it was a stranger. He looked at Violet like she was a stranger. He looked at Violet like she was a stranger. Maybe for the first time he saw her. The room changed temperature. The candles seemed too bright. The air thickened. The planter made a sound from the bottom of his chest, and then another. The neighbor gulped air that didn't want to be caught. Open a window, someone said. The window opened. The night pushed in and did nothing. The doctor wouldn't arrive in time. Violet had counted the streets in her head. She had measured the distance between this beginning and the end she'd chosen. She stood by the sideboard, hands folded again, eyes lowered, breath steady. She felt the entire house watching itself come apart. In the doorway, Elsie appeared for a blink and vanished. Aunt Thelma's hand on her shoulder. Good. The children were out. The quarters were fed. The kitchen was clean. The master reached for his glass and knocked it over. Red bled across the linen and pooled near his hand. He stared at the spreading stain like it held an answer. He looked up once more. His mouth opened. He said her name again, softer this time, like a prayer that didn't know who it was meant for. Violet didn't answer. She just stood there, quiet as steam, while the laughter drained from the room and something older took its place.